Good morning from Central Europe. This is Marius Dragomir, and I am the director of the Center for Media, Data and Society at the Budapest-based Democracy Institute. And I welcome you today to a debate about a very controversial topic, making tech giants pay for news content. Australia grabbed the headlines last week and last year, as well with its plans to adopt legislation that would force global tech companies to pay for media content shared on their platforms. Technology giants such as Google and Facebook criticized the planned rules, threatening to take drastic steps if the legal provisions are adopted. Such steps would cut access for millions of Australians to Facebook's and Google's services. The goal of this legislation, the Australian government says, is to give publishers, as one official put it, a level playing field to ensure a fair go. Tech companies are accused of disrupting the news media business, forcing media companies to shed jobs or even entirely shut down operations. So will this law solve the problem? And what about restricting content online? Isn't that bad for internet freedom? For the next 30 minutes or so, I will be talking about these issues and more, I hope, with two guests who know the field very well. Benedetta Brevini, journalist and professor at the University of Sydney, and Bernard Keane, political editor with the Australian magazine Crikey, both authors of several important books about media and internet. Before starting, I just want to tell our audience that if you have questions or comments, please post them on our Facebook streaming page. But first, let me just go to you, Benedetta. Can you just summarize for us, on the one hand, the key provisions of the law, and two, what are the next steps in the law approval process?
Yes, so thank you, Marius, for having me and for having us to discuss this very important and crucial issue for digital platform regulation that no doubt can be seen as a global test for regulation of tech giants around the world. And I think that when last week Google threatened to remove its search engine from Australia, we suddenly saw an incredible surge in global media coverage of the issue. So just to give you an idea of the issue that we are currently debating, it was on December the 9th last year when the Treasury Laws Amendments, that is known as the News, Media and Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code, Bill 2020, was introduced at the Parliament. But this resulted from a very long and very contested process between the Australian Competition Authority, which is the ACCC, the Australian government, and of course, the digital giants, so Google and Facebook. And it all started back in December 2017, when in fact the Competition Authority was directed by the government to consider the so-called impact of online searching engines and social media and digital content, so the entire digital platform world, and especially as regards to competition matters, of course, within its remit. And then in December 2019, the ACC, with the Digital Platforms Inquiry, recommended a voluntary code. Okay, so we're talking about voluntary back then. And the code aimed and was supposed to address the bargaining power imbalance that the competition authority and the entire world is basically recognizing between the major digital platforms, so Google and Facebook, and media businesses. And this is something that we've seen pretty much everywhere. Now, they are actually under scrutiny and progressive scrutiny around the world. So obviously, what the competition authority recognized was that the digital platforms and the businesses, the media businesses, were what they were defined as unavoidable trading partners. And because of this, the government directed the ACCC to work with both the news providers and the digital platforms for a few months to develop a voluntary code. So at that point, it was all in the realm of the voluntary. But then in April 2010, what happened was that the ACC advised that it was almost impossible to reach an agreement. And if you read the statements by Google and Facebook, they would disagree with this. They all say that they were almost about to develop this voluntary proposal, and so they decided that at this point, it was better to consider a mandatory bargaining code, because otherwise it would have never happened. So what happened is that in July 2020, so just last year, the ACC released this draft legislation that we're now discussing. And at that point, after significant consultation with the industry, amendments have been discussed and introduced to the so-called Treasury Laws amendments, bill to the Parliament, and then it has been referred to the Senate committee. And so this is where it stands at the moment. And the reason why we're talking probably today, and also the reason why the entire world is reacting to this, is that last week we had the first hearing at the Senate committee, and we had representatives from Google and Facebook, and also major news entities participating in the hearing. So what happens next? We have one public hearing next week on the 1st of February. And at that point, the Senate committee will have to issue the report. And we're expecting the report by the 12th of February. And at that point, and I'm sure that Bernard can provide also more details on this, but we know that there is labor support, for example, so support from the opposition party. And so it could be a very quick, actually, decision on the bill.
That's great. Thank you so much for summarizing that. Yes, Bernard. So, what are the chances that these provisions will be adopted? I know it's a difficult question because we don't know where this will go. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a very strong chance that a bill of some kind will go through. So there's support, as Benedetta said, there's support from the opposition. There's support even from minor parties, which make up the swing votes in the Senate. So even if Labor opposed it, it was going to go through in some form. I think the process from here is really going to hinge on what the government thinks about the threat by Google last week to cut off services. I think there's a view within the government that Google's bluffing. I don't think that's the case. I think the media here in Australia, who are almost completely united in support of this bill, think that Google's bluffing as well. There's not a very much sort of opposition. The opposition's come from some in the media, like myself, some economists, and obviously from the big internet players. I mean, this whole process, as Benedetta outlined, and this whole process sprang from a much broader consideration of the broad economic relationship between the big tech companies and those who use their services. And what the government did at the behest of big media companies here, and particularly News Corporation, is really cherry pick a couple of big issues, and the most significant one, of course, being revenue. And that's why we moved from a voluntary process, as was originally proposed, to a process that's much more legislated and much more focused purely on the issue of how much money are they going to force Google and Facebook to actually transfer to Australian media companies. And that's obviously that's an example that Google and Facebook are very, very unwilling to accept. So that's why I say I don't really believe it when people say that Google are just bluffing about cutting off Australian services. They have a very strong economic incentive, much beyond whatever they might pay to Australian media companies to block this. So the government's assessment of that, I think, is really going to be crucial in what form that bill passes in the next 2 months.
Yes, thank you so much, Bernard. Now you said in what form the bill will pass. Now you are in the content business, so to speak. If adopted in this current form, or more or less in the current form, what will this mean in practice for journalists and the media?
Well, the bill's predicated on a false assumption, and it's interesting actually that the ACCC, the competition body, actually refuted this argument in its reports. But nonetheless, the bill is really based on an argument that that Google and Facebook steal content from the media companies and make money off it. And the basic goal of the bill, in relation to the process of producing an agreement, is to force some sort of agreement for revenue transfer from the big companies to media companies, notionally for the content that they've stolen. Now, that argument simply doesn't stand up. They don't steal content. they don't steal revenue. The interesting thing about the situation in Australia, and I suspect it's true in other jurisdictions as well, is that a lot of the revenue that has been lost by media companies over the last 20 years due to the internet and digitisation here in Australia hasn't gone to Google and Facebook. It's actually gone to pure play internet companies, many of which are actually owned by the media companies themselves. So one of the biggest, probably the biggest source of revenue for Australian journalism since World War II has been real estate advertising. And now the both major media companies, News Corporation and Nine Fairfax, both actually have dominant shares in the two largest online real estate companies. So they're the companies that benefit from that flow of revenue, and the same situation applies elsewhere. Nonetheless, the bill is based, as I said, on this idea that there's got to be a revenue transfer from the big tech giants to media companies. And the mechanism for doing that is pretty simple. It's the tech giants, Google, for example, it offers one figure. The media company offers another figure, almost certainly much bigger, and an arbitrator has to select between those two figures. There's no bargaining, there's no compromise, there's no negotiation. It's a choice between two figures, and it really leaves the tech companies with very little room to move in terms of how they deal with this.
And this arbiter that you mentioned, who's that going to be? Is that going to be an independent body or a body appointed by the government, or what are the odds?
I think it's going to be a panel, but it will be appointed by another regulator, which is the Communications Media Regulator. So there'll be notionally independent panel, but I think it's probably implausible to think that a panel would be appointed that would be inclined to select the lower of the options when it comes to the amounts of money that are involved here. So, I mean, we'll see what happens if that comes to pass, but it's a process dressed up or a process that is designed to create the impression that there's some sort of independent process that's underway here, when really it's a process that's stacked against the tech companies.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Building on what you just said, I also want to address this issue of the high media ownership concentration in Australia. I remember a study some 5 years ago from Columbia University that found Australia at the time to be the most concentrated newspaper industry after China and Egypt, which is quite crazy to read. Also, I read more recently that the 4 largest newspaper publishers in Australia, according to the latest count, had a 92% market share combined. But all these numbers make me wonder whether, these planned rules are not in a way going to protect the business interest of just a few powerful media players rather than independent journalism. Benedetta, what do you say about that?
This is really precisely my major concern, because this is happening during at the same time where there is a major Senate inquiry into media diversity in this country, which is a great opportunity to finally address the problem of concentration. I've started developing a new study on concentration after the multiple changes in the law. The latest were in 2017. And I found 2 things immediately as I start struggling with gathering data. I don't know if you remember that a few years back, Marius, all together, we did the Open Society Media Transparency Report. And I remember that back then, it was also backed by Council of Europe recommendations and European Union, that it was crucial to have media transparency. And so to understand the stakes of, and the level of concentration is one of the crucial matter also for democracy. And so the first hurdle that I'm finding in developing a media concentration is that there are not many data available. So for instance, since 2018, News Corporation decided not to release circulation numbers. So we can't really compare what happened, between 2018. We have a so-called average number that we can use and of users. And so we did that, and the calculation is that, in fact, now we have about 92% of the market that is controlled by the top for companies. And we also have News Corp that controls about 52% in the newspaper market, okay? So these are really, really surprising numbers, especially when we consider that one of the most common, for example, suggestions by the European Commission was always to have caps, for example, at 20%, right? So just to give you an idea also to the public. But what is really worrisome is that between around 2008 and 2018, so across a decade, we saw something like a 15% decrease in regional and local newspaper titles, and about 106 local newspaper titles closed. So there is a crucial need for provision of local news in this country, which is, not and never addressed by major news organizations such as the New York Times, which is always, the argument that has been put forward, and again in the hearing last week by News Corp, for example. It's not that because we have availability of online news content that covers, what happens in the US, that we sort out the problem of media diversity. So the problem with the code, as Bernard was saying, obviously, if you have a business that is solid and you have capacity and you have a dominant stake in the market, then you are able to bargain much better, right, with the digital platforms. And in fact, there is a provision that worries me a lot because it says that the revenues of the company that can register with ACMA for the for the code have to be like of $150,000. That means that if you are a startup, or if you're just starting, you can't even start like debating and negotiating a code. You can't even initiate the problem. But then the other issue that I haven't seen reporting in the media, for example, at all, was that we don't know exactly, there is no provision, no kind of public service obligation of what to do with the money. So once the funds has been given to this media business, what are they going to do with the money? We don't know. There is no discussion about how to share it and how, that can be addressed. And this worries me, of course, because it would be all in the hands of the major consolidated big corporations that are going to just negotiate between themselves. So, like in my view, and I'm a communication policy expert that compares and likes to compare better also benchmarks and better policies around the world. And in my view, like having a levy on this amount of revenues that of course they generate, because although it's true that classified ads ended up in other kind of news websites, it's also true that the way and the reason why these digital platforms really attract so many users is also because they share content and they don't provide any contribution to that kind of content. So how do you address this? Well, you enforce a levy. And I don't know, but I found this incredible data from the hearing and also last week. And when you hear that Google made 4.3 billion in advertising in Australia, just in Australia, 23 million inhabitants, and 0.7 billion were made by Facebook, and then Google only paid 59 million of tax, then you wonder where there is an opportunity. And the interesting thing is that in both the hearings, the companies, the digital platforms said, yes, we're willing to pay more taxes, but they're now threatening to leave, if they are actually forced to pay. So I think that actually these are very important considerations, and there are a variety of ways to address this, but I don't think that using just the bargaining code and competition law is the only solution, because I don't see this as a solution to media concentration. It's only going to increase media concentration, of course.
Thank you so much, Benedetta. I think the point about the public interest in the media is crucial here, because otherwise we'll have an agreement where, in fact, money from the tech companies will go to corporations that I'm not so sure they really care about the public interest in the media. But we have questions coming to us. One is literally about the code. Someone is asking, could you please further elaborate why the initial self-regulatory code attempt failed? And another one, which is quite interesting, is what were the most debated and contested points on which tech and media organizations could not agree? I guess those are quite straightforward, but Bernard, you want to take that?
So, I mean, the the failure of the process, the voluntary aspect of the process, I think was always foreordained. The big tech companies never had any intention of agreeing to the kinds of sums of money that the big media companies wanted. I mean, the big media companies were talking about numbers like $1 billion and $500 million in terms of revenue they wanted to get off the tech giants. So whether that was an ambit claim or not, there was never going to be any sort of agreement that was going to deliver those sorts of numbers. There are other aspects of the legislation or that have emerged from the code, such as there's a requirement for Google and Facebook to alert media companies in advance of changes to their algorithms that's going to affect how results are displayed. That's enormously problematic for the big media companies. So it's been revenue and it's been algorithms that have been the most contested points. But I mean, just to elaborate a bit on both on that question and what Benedetta has spoken about, I mean, to really understand this legislation and this whole process of developing the legislation, you've got to understand, and I'm not sort of using hyperbole here. Australia is politically at the federal level one of the most corrupt countries in the world in terms of Western democracies, at least. It presents as a democracy with a good electoral system and good policy processes, but in fact, vested interests and large corporations in Australia play a monumental role in the development of policy right across a whole group of different areas, most particularly an area like climate change, but media policy also. In fact, I mean, I worked in media policy within the government about 15 years ago, up until about 15 years ago, and I saw it from the inside. The process, you talked earlier about the lack of a public interest perspective and all this. Australian media policy has never been driven by the public interest, never. It's always been driven by the interests of the large corporations who make up our media, and in particular our free-to-air broadcasters, because they traditionally hold the most power. In fact, our free-to-air broadcasters used to be so powerful that even News Corporation would struggle to get its way against the power of the big television broadcasters. So media policy in Australia has always been based on the vested interests of the incumbents. This is simply another example of that, and the interests of consumers, of civil society concerns, free speech, internet censorship. Those sorts of issues have always been a distant second to what the large companies have wanted. And that's really been what's driven this process all along. That's why the government has skewed it from what was initially a very interesting and worthwhile process of looking at the playing field around negotiations between tech companies and the people who use their services. And it's been redirected into this process of delivering revenue to our large media companies.
Thank you. Benedetta, if you want to add something on that, but before doing that,
well, quickly, I just want to add one point, which I find very interesting from a media diversion tactic that is being used in the political sphere here, which is like, we now know that there is a strong need and there is a media inquiry into diversity, right? For public interest journalism and for a variety of voices. And to me, it's extraordinary that while the Senate is starting collecting submissions and the hearings will start on the 19th of February about this problem of media diversity, like we're only talking about the power of digital platforms. And in a way, the public discussion has been completely overwhelmed by this discussion on Google and the power of Google and Facebook. And although, of course, I'm the first that would like to see a levy on the digital giants to contribute in the public interest, the major problem is not really the fact that Australian citizens are consuming news on Facebook or on Google, because this is the same kind of content. And so the lack of diversity is still there, even if they consume it on Facebook or Google. So in a way, I really find that it's been really pushed in a way that it's completely overshadowing the other major and crucial issue for Australia, which is trying to address the problem of concentration.
Absolutely, and I also wanted to add that there is a problem, I would think about how much the Australian example will encourage maybe authoritarian regimes, and we already have some of those in Europe, to actually introduce such restrictions to use this such legislation to introduce restrictions on internet freedom. And we already see attempts in a number of countries in Europe. But we only have the last 4 or 5 minutes, and we have another question. Somebody is asking whether there is a chance that Google will remove certain features like Google News, as it happened in Spain after the link tag. So I guess the question is whether Google will remove entirely its services from Australia, or whether you think they will find a solution to just remove some of them. But I think the bigger question here is how bad would that be for news media if companies like Google just remove everything from the country? Bernard, you want to comment on that?
I think it will be. I mean, as I suggested earlier, I mean this myth that the tech companies steal content hides a reality, which is that Google, in particular, in fact, mainly Google. Let's talk about mainly Google in this context, is crucial to driving traffic toward media sites, and therefore crucial to. I mean, if you work in the media in Australia, I mean, we talk now about a funnel in which people get interested in content. They then look at your content, and then they might subscribe to your particular product. So that funnel is, the way that subscription-based businesses, and most media companies here now are subscription-based. That's how they get subscribers. And Google, in particular, is the very first stage of that process. And if you don't have that process, then obviously you're cutting off a lot of supply of potential subscribers. So I think the impact will potentially be quite significant. There's been a lot of debate here in the aftermath of the comments from Google last week, saying, well, there are other search engines, and we can cope. And I think there's a bit of a rude awakening coming for media companies that think that it will be reasonably straightforward. They all have subscribers who will continue to find their product very easily. The question is, how do they get new subscribers? And removing Google, I think, is going to be a significant element of that. Google may cherry pick what services it doesn't provide. Facebook may do exactly the same. Google News actually generates virtually no revenue at all for Google. It's one of the arguments that's persistently put forward is the one service that's actually structured around delivering people to content produced by the major media companies actually doesn't make any money because they don't put ads on it. So, all the ad revenue that the media companies want to access is actually off in the general section of Google, not in Google News. So, as I said, I think there'll be a bit of a shock coming for companies that think that they can prosper in a Google-less Australia.
Benedetta, the last word is yours.
Well, we also already have the example of Spain, and I was reading a study that was done last year precisely on Google News when it was removed in Spain, and actually it seemed that the news outlet that suffered the most were the smallest one. And I'm not surprised by that. But at the same time, I also tend to disagree on the idea that actually Google is not in any way getting an advantage of, from the news, because it is true. And they keep repeating that the news queries are only the 1.25% of the entirety of the news, the queries that they get on Google. But at the same time, they will attract and users will go to the platform also because they can share news and they can look for news. So, we shouldn't really underestimate that. But the problem is that everything here gets monetized and in a way that has to be absolutely quantified. And this is precisely what we shouldn't be doing. We should be taxing Google and Facebook because they're not contributing to any form of public interest, because public interest journalism is facing a huge crisis. And in this way, then we'll need to reestablish and redistribute these resources, but just in the public interest, just to public service interest. And so here you go again.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, on this note, hoping to continue our conversation with another occasion, Benedetta Brevini, Bernard Keane, thank you so much for being with us today. Also, a big thanks to our followers. I just want to remind you that those of you who are busy will be able to watch the entire discussion on Facebook and YouTube. And of course, we hope to have you with us next time for the upcoming events. Follow the Center for Media, Data and Society and the Democracy Institute. So long, see you next time.